What's going on, guys? In another edition of Expanding Our Menu as Coaches, I wanted to go over an option that I use that serves as a warm-up or activation option. It also serves as a strategy improvement option, and it's also used at times for me for training purposes as well, or to get a training effect out of this movement. Now, I've talked before about the difficulty of some athletes, especially those I work with that are basketball players, because they are taller and they have these sort of odd body shapes. It makes it difficult for them to change levels without a reference, or change levels in a trainable way in the weight room without some sort of aid. What I mean by a reference is either having a wall behind you and having your back against the wall, holding handles like I've talked about in previous videos that would be in front of you. And again, these are things that just help the athlete perform the exercise in a trainable way. So what I want to go over today is why we would use what I would call this wall-supported squat, or wall-supported, for today's purpose, iso hold in that squat position, okay? So first, what does that look like? Well, we're going to get into this position. Okay, that's maybe an end goal. Okay, now this isn't that wall squat that we used to all do back in high school football or basketball, that you just kind of shot your legs in front of you and just stand like this, and people put like 15 plates on top of you and the coach is walking over your thighs. That's not really doing anything for us as far as what our athletes need. But I think we can do this wall supported squat in a way that really fosters a change or de-threatens a position, i.e. knee flexion, dorsiflexion, and starts the athlete feeling some muscle tone or muscle challenge during this versus kind of a tendinous, painful challenge, okay? Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the first thing I'm talking to an athlete about when we get against a wall like this is this torso reference. It's a great way to start talking to an athlete about setting a pelvis after you maybe have done some more supine or prone sort of work, maybe some all fours work on the ground. This is a nice way to kind of stand up and say, hey, that all fours belly lift that we may have done to find a neutral position, just flip that up to standing, and then we're going to do the same thing on the wall, for instance, okay? So if I get that athlete standing on a wall and I reference, for instance, if it's a belly lift, or maybe in somebody else's world it's a cat-cow sort of situation, then we can talk about that torso position and what I'll cue to get the torso position that I want, to spare some of the auxiliary muscles we may not want to use during this exercise when we're targeting quad, maybe a quad challenge or an anterior leg portion of your leg challenge. I want to take some things out of the movement, i.e. some of this positioning, in other words, okay? So to do that, there's going to be that rib cage with exhale cue. Now we're trying to find rib cage internal rotation to achieve some semblance of what people would call neutral. Okay, I wish there was a better way to describe that, because I know we can break down neutral and say, well, that's not really neutral. Okay, I get it. But most of the time, we find this externally rotated rib cage that maybe with some internal rotation via a cue that I like to use, an exhale and reach, we can find some semblance of a neutral position. And in layman's terms, we're getting that your back flat against the wall. Okay, so how do we do that? If I see an athlete like this against the wall and they're going squat like this, and I have space between low back, here's a cue of an exhale and maybe even fingertips on rib cage to start getting that rib cage down. Now, that's not going to solve anything, because internal rotation of ribs may not solve low back space in between wall. That may be solved with an additional cue of posterior tilting of pelvis, okay? Now again, let's be careful with words here. We are not saying in this instance that we are excessively rounding. This is not what we're looking for. We're not trying to go from one extreme to the other. We're trying to find the middle. Now, this reference to the ground, or something I've spoke about before, is so key for our basketball players, because so many times they're just camping out on their toes and using these tendinous structures, as I've talked about before, as their means of propulsion. So it's so key to give these guys a reference and then challenge them in the positions that are usually a bit tough for them, or maybe a little bit painful. And this is not everyone. I'm not saying every basketball player has ankle issues, knee pain, etc., or that every basketball player has a tendinopathy issue, but that's a common thing in our sport. So let's cater to that and squat or change levels in a way that de-threatens or allows us to have a better strategy when we're changing levels in a squatting sort of motion, or when we're changing levels in a more hip flexion oriented motion. So we've talked about the torso, and we've talked about the exhale, we've talked about a hip posterior tilt to flatten my back up against the wall, okay? Now, once I find that, again, here's that correction. For me, it's a slight hip tuck. It's an exhale to get ribs internally rotating to get out of that excessive external rotating rib flared position. Now I can slide down the wall, but I'm cueing a slide down the wall with or fostering some sort of dorsiflexion at the ankle, knee flexion with a grounded heel, maintaining a foot arch, okay? Whatever allows the athlete to do that, or whatever distance of feet away from wall that allows the athlete to check all those boxes. For me, right now I've got what I want. I've got a quad challenge with grounded heel, full foot interaction with the ground, and an upright torso, and I've spared all the other auxiliary musculature that I don't want to use in this version of the movement. Now, of course, there's some adjustments that will need to be made when you expose the athlete to this, because the athlete may be used to kind of shooting their feet out in front of you and almost having like a negative shin angle in the squat. Okay, try to move feet a bit closer to the wall so I can show some sort of dorsiflexion with a knee tracking over feet. But if that happens and they're not used to that, maybe they go right into that heel off the ground position, or their weight shifts forward, or they're still kind of pushing back. So we have to have these cues of, okay, there's your position for now. Maybe we can get further or closer to the wall as you progress and show this position here, okay? Still grounded, we're good, we can maintain that position. And then we're holding for a specific amount of time, at least in these initial stages. So I can begin this process of saying to them, okay, what do we feel when a knee tracks over your foot? Are you feeling quads? Are you feeling any pain? Maybe you don't have the reference. Yeah, I feel pain. Once I give you that grounded reference, then I give you that directional cue of pushing directly upwards, maybe we reduce some of that knee pain or some challenge at the Achilles tendon or whatever it may be, and we reduce the body's perceived threat of this having to happen. Instead of avoiding that and using more of a hip flex propulsive strategy, we're okay with a knee bend, dorsiflexion, push off. So to then put that all together, I have a position here that initially I have maybe in a warm-up, again, this activation buzzword that is allowing for some sort of burning sensation, right, in quads. If we term that activation these days, okay, that's what we're doing, to say, once I get in this position, I've got my rib cage cue, I've got my hip cue, I've got my heel reference cue, I've got my positional cues of dorsiflexion, knee flexion, knees tracking over feet, and then if need be, I have a reaching cue, but not an excessive rolled forward crunch reach, okay? That's something to think about as well. We're not going from one extreme to the other, and that's for all these sorts of movements, okay? So once I can find this and I'm thinking I'm cueing to push directly upwards, not backwards, not falling forwards, then I think we have something here where if holding this position for 20 to 30 seconds for 3 sets in a warm-up, I think you begin this process of an athlete understanding what changing levels in a squatting sort of movement should feel like and look like, and then we're bridging that with a reference to maybe eventually goblet squat, eventually just have to have an anterior support, or who knows, we eventually have a safety bar on one's back with some sort of support, and we can start moving more in that straight up and down sort of trainable motion of a squat. Now, to clear up some of these things with reaching, I think that's a concept that is very fashionable now, and coaches talk more and more about this. And when they talk about reaching, we're referring to sort of this correctional cue to then get rid of this excessive rib flared position. Now, we have to be careful here, at least for me, if I'm using this as sort of a teaching tool to eventually bridge into a trainable squat, where option-wise for me, just quickly to note, like I'm working towards maybe a foam roller or ball behind back and sliding up and down wall. I'm going to camp out in isos for a while on the wall, and you can use your imagination if you stick to principles and build this as a trainable exercise on your menu for an athlete. And they may stay here with a wall reference, and they may not need to, based on outcome measures we're chasing, they may not need an anterior support. They may not need to eventually go to a goblet squat or a safety bar squat, just because there's no outcome measure that we would chase or look to improve for that athlete where we would need to be advancing the squat. There's a ton of things we can do with this sort of wall reference or something so they can reference some sort of torso here, or sorry, a torso reference. We can do a ton of things with that without having to leave this if we don't need to. Okay, so again, with that reach and that cueing of the reach, where we get in trouble, at least for me, I'm not going to look like this in my squat. That's just not going to happen. That is excessive, okay? This is where we get caught up with the polarization of some of these subjects, is this is not one pendulum swing to the other or one extreme to the other. This is a cue to then find neutral, like I've said before. And what is neutral for each athlete? Who knows? But it's a cue you have in the bank or in your toolbox that if you see a position you know you can use maybe to remedy that position. Like I said, a reach and a rib cage depression or down or internal rotation cue may not fix the fact that they're stuck in an anterior tilt, and you'll have to add in a posterior tilting cue, okay? You still may have to do that. Now, if I'm reaching, I'm stressing that the reach, and reach is even sort of a bad word for it, is the reach is the goal of getting rib cage, or by reaching, our goal is to get rib cage down. So it's not bench pressing our way away from the wall. It is having arms in front or even here, whatever you need to do, stressing that this is meant for this. It's not meant for this, okay? So let your breath in this case provide the positional correction, not a bench press yourself away from the wall sort of situation, okay? So just to clear up that reaching cue, because I see that kind of being a bit, confusing for some folks at times. So now, what is my initial prescription with these? And I've mentioned it before, but quickly to say, my initial prescription may be a 2 to 3 sets of a 20 to 30 second isometric hold with an athlete, depending on how strong they are in this position. Now, if I sit here, and this is not what we would call in the strength coach world, we love talking about depth. If this is not a deep enough squat for you, okay, I get it. But for me, I'm feeling what I want to feel. Now, if we can move lower for an athlete over time, okay, cool. Now I'm challenging a deeper range. That's great. But I'm not too worried about that at the start. Find a comfortable range, find a non-painful, trainable range, and hold there. Okay, 2 to 3 sets, 20 to 30 seconds. Then what can we do? We can add weight to that same volume protocol, so increase the intensity. We can then start adding a bit of motion to that. So in other words, if I'm against a wall Now I can start talking about strategy. So if I'm adding motion here and I don't have a foam roller or a ball behind me, but if I'm sliding up and down this wall, a lot of times an athlete wants to push backwards coming out of a squat so they can kind of get to this position. I'm going to cue that athlete to push straight up and show me that you can keep those knees forward over foot, keep that dorsiflex position, and push. Your challenge being push vertically versus push back and then up. And I think we get more of a quad challenge out of that. And I think for a lot of our basketball athletes, quads are the show for a lot of these guys. Okay, so then I can start talking about strategy. In this bottom position, small movements, up and down, trying to cue, and even for me it's a bit tough, cueing knees forward in that small range. Then I start going full range with whatever implement I need behind me. So then I'm moving full squat reps up and down. And then maybe I'm adding weight to that, increasing intensity to that. Maybe I can do some statodynamic work here with some sort of tempo, or some sort of 3 down, 3 up tempo. And think about how that begins to change an athlete's strategy of how they change levels. So then in saying all that, think of all the options you have for this athlete to start this process of understanding how to ground themselves, how to feel a reference between their feet in the ground in a way that starts them understanding how to push using maybe more, as we would say, again, buzzwords, but active structures versus our passive structures that we would refer to as these tendinous structures that guys like to use. Now, what does this lead to? Well, our hope is that there's a reduction in that in those tendon pathologies that we see that are so common in basketball. So if you're a coach out there and you want to dive in and you get your athletes into squats and you're saying, okay, well, goblet squat, as we've talked about before, that's not the simplest version of that exercise. Just because you put a weight in front of you doesn't mean that anything's going to be cleaned up. I know in the past we've spoke about that as strength coaches, like, well, let's just front squat because that cleans up the pattern. Well, no, it doesn't. We still have terrible looking squats, even with a barbell in front of you. So get to the simplest version. And in my world, this isn't maybe the simplest, but it allows, I think, a greater chance for a bit more of a reference aid to get the athlete moving or successfully performing a squat in a trainable way, in which I don't think you get without some of these references, at least initially. And again, if I know that using isometric holds, using statodynamic work in some aspects, or using these slower tempos, for instance, if we're just working eccentrically in these parts of the movement, and we know that they're so beneficial for these guys to take some of the stress, some knee stress away from them, or start building these patterns, that maybe if you begin to do things with this better strategy, then you see that manifest in a game as somebody who is now using some things that they didn't use before and maximizing their force production because they're not so passive in these movements, just being sort of the bouncy, tendinous athletes that they like to be. And we see less of the changing levels for a basketball player like this, and we see more of them being comfortable with this here and being able to get low, get in a stance without the avoidance pattern that we've talked about before in jumps and things like that.